The fluorescent lights above my head buzzed like angry wasps, sending sharp needles of pain straight through my skull and into my soul. I was 36 years old, sitting in a sterile conference room in Toronto, and I could not breathe. My hands trembled as I stared at the manila folder in front of me. The same folder that had been hidden in my parents' basement for 28 years. The same folder that contained the truth they never wanted me to know. Diagnosis: Autism spectrum disorder. Patient: Margot Ellison. Age: 8 years old. I had been 8 years old when a child psychologist had written those words. 8 years old when my entire identity had been documented, analyzed, and then buried. My mother's voice echoed in my memory like a broken record. You are just sensitive, Margot. Nothing is wrong with you, so stop acting like there is. But there had been something. There had always been something. And they knew it. The room spun around me as 28 years of confusion, shame, and self-doubt came crashing down like a tidal wave. Every meltdown I had been punished for. Every social interaction that had felt like walking through quicksand. Every moment I had wondered why the world seemed so impossibly loud, bright, and overwhelming while everyone else moved through it with such ease. They knew. They had always known. And they chose to let me suffer in silence rather than give me the tools to understand myself. The discovery had started innocently enough. I had been cleaning out my childhood home after my father's funeral, moving through rooms filled with memories that felt more like ghosts than comfort. My mother had been upstairs, directing my cousin Zara through decades of accumulated possessions with the precision of a military general. Just throw away anything medical, she had called down to me. No point keeping old paperwork. But something had made me pause when I found that folder. Something about the way it was buried beneath Christmas decorations and forgotten photo albums. As if it had been intentionally hidden rather than simply stored. The moment I opened it, my entire world shifted on its axis. There were pages and pages of notes, behavioral observations, test results, recommendations for therapy and support, all dated from when I was 7 and 8 years old, all describing a little girl who could not make eye contact, who had intense reactions to certain textures and sounds, who struggled with social cues but showed exceptional intelligence in specific areas. A little girl who was clearly, undeniably, beautifully autistic. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter from Dr. Helena Voss, the child psychologist who had evaluated me. It was addressed to my parents, dated March 15th, when I was 8 years old. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, it began. After extensive evaluation, I can confirm that Margot meets the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. While this diagnosis may feel overwhelming, I want to assure you that with proper support and understanding, Margot can thrive. Early intervention and acceptance of her neurological differences will be crucial for her emotional and social development. The letter went on to recommend therapies, support groups, and educational accommodations. It painted a picture of hope and possibility, of a future where I could understand myself and find my place in the world. But that future had been stolen from me. Instead, I had grown up believing I was defective, broken, too sensitive, too dramatic. Too much. I had spent 3 decades trying to fix something that was never meant to be fixed, trying to become someone I was never meant to be. The memories came flooding back with devastating clarity. I was 9 years old, standing in our kitchen after another disastrous day at school. The other children had been playing a game during recess, something with complex social rules that I could not grasp no matter how hard I tried. When I had attempted to join in, they had laughed and told me I was weird, and did not get it. I had come home crying, desperate for answers. Why can I not seem to get people the way they get me? I had asked my mother, my voice breaking with confusion and pain. She had looked at me with those cold blue eyes, the same ones that stared back at me from the mirror every morning, and smiled that tight, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. You are just sensitive, Margot. Nothing is wrong with you, so stop acting like there is. But everything had been wrong. Not with me, but with the lie she was forcing me to live. I remembered being 10 years old, having a complete meltdown in a department store because the fluorescent lights felt like they were burning holes in my retinas, and the noise of the crowd was like nails on a chalkboard inside my skull. I had collapsed on the floor, covering my ears and sobbing, unable to process the sensory assault. My father had dragged me to the car while my mother apologized to strangers with embarrassed whispers about me being dramatic and high-strung. At home, they had sent me to my room without dinner, telling me that my behavior was unacceptable and that I needed to learn to control myself. Control myself. As if I could control the way my nervous system processed the world. As if I could simply choose to not be overwhelmed by stimuli that felt like physical pain. I remembered being 12 years old, practicing conversations in the mirror for hours before social events, trying to memorize the right facial expressions and responses like an actor preparing for the performance of her life. Because that is what every social interaction had felt like. A performance where I did not know the script and everyone else seemed to have been born knowing their lines. My parents had called it putting on airs, and told me to just be natural. But natural for me was stimmying by flapping my hands when I was excited, or needing to line up my belongings in specific patterns, or avoiding eye contact because it felt like staring into the sun. Natural for me was info-dumping about my special interests for hours, or needing complete silence to focus, or feeling physically ill when plans changed unexpectedly. None of that had been acceptable to them. So I had learned to mask, to hide, to pretend to be someone I was not. And the cost had been devastating. By the time I was 16, I was having panic attacks almost daily. The weight of constantly performing neurotypicality had become unbearable, but I had no words for what I was experiencing. I had thought I was broken, that something fundamental was wrong with my brain. My parents had taken me to therapy, but they had carefully curated the information they shared with the therapist. They had painted my struggles as behavioral issues, as teenage rebellion, as anything except what they actually were. The natural response of an autistic person forced to live in constant sensory and social overwhelm without any understanding or support. The therapist had diagnosed me with anxiety and depression, which were accurate but incomplete. They were symptoms, not the root cause. But my parents had been satisfied with that explanation because it did not challenge their narrative that I was simply difficult rather than different. I had been prescribed medication for anxiety, which had helped somewhat with the panic attacks, but had done nothing to address the underlying issues. The sensory sensitivities, the social confusion, the desperate need for routine and predictability in a world that seemed determined to be chaotic. College had been a nightmare of masking and burnout. I had chosen a small school in Montreal, partly to get away from my parents' constant judgment, and partly because the smaller environment felt more manageable. But I had still struggled immensely with the social aspects of university life. I had lived alone in a single dorm room, avoiding parties and social events that felt like torture chambers of noise and unpredictable social dynamics. My classmates had thought I was antisocial or stuck up, but the truth was that I had been desperately trying to survive in an environment that felt hostile to my nervous system. Academically, I had excelled in subjects that interested me, literature, psychology, computer science, but had struggled in classes that required group work or presentations. Public speaking had felt like being flayed alive, not because I did not know the material but because the social performance aspect had been overwhelming. I had graduated with honors but had felt like a fraud the entire time, like I was successfully fooling everyone into thinking I was normal, when inside I had been falling apart. My early career had followed a similar pattern. I had gravitated toward jobs that allowed me to work independently, in quiet environments with minimal social interaction. I had been drawn to research positions, data analysis roles, anything that let me hyper-focus on complex problems without having to navigate the minefield of office politics and small talk. My colleagues had generally liked me but had considered me quirky and intense. I had been the person who ate lunch alone at her desk, who wore noise-canceling headphones, who always seemed to know obscure facts about random topics, but struggled to make casual conversation. I had thought this was just my personality. Introverted, analytical, a little socially awkward but ultimately fine. But it had not been fine. The constant effort of masking, of trying to appear normal in a neurotypical world, had been slowly destroying me from the inside out. By my late 20s, I had been experiencing what I now know was autistic burnout, a state of complete physical and emotional exhaustion that occurs when an autistic person can no longer maintain the energy required to mask their neurological differences. I had been sleeping 12 hours a day, but still feeling exhausted. I had lost interest in activities I had previously enjoyed. I had been having more frequent sensory overload episodes, more difficulty with executive functioning, more problems with emotional regulation. I had thought I was having a quarter-life crisis, or maybe developing chronic fatigue syndrome. I had been to countless doctors, had countless tests, but no one had been able to explain what was happening to me. It had not been until I was 31, working at a tech startup in Toronto, that the first crack had appeared in the wall of denial my parents had built around my true identity. I had been having lunch in the break room, eating alone as usual while reading an article on my phone about pattern recognition and artificial intelligence. I had been completely absorbed in the content, occasionally making small excited sounds when I encountered particularly interesting concepts. My colleague Jasper had been sitting at the next table with his partner Kai, and I had heard him mention something about autism and stimmying. My ears had perked up, not because I thought it related to me, but because I had always been fascinated by psychology and neuroscience. I had listened as they discussed Kai's recent autism diagnosis at age 28, how it had explained so many things about their childhood and adult experiences, how they had always felt different but had not known why. How getting the diagnosis had been like finally having a map for territory they had been wandering lost in for decades. Something about their conversation had resonated with me in a way I could not quite explain. Later that day, Jasper had approached my desk where I had been working with my noise-canceling headphones on, surrounded by the fidget toys I had never thought twice about needing. "Hey Margot," he had said gently. "I hope this does not sound presumptuous, but have you ever looked into being on the spectrum?" I had laughed. Actually laughed out loud. "I would have known by now," I had said with complete confidence. "I mean, I have been through therapy. I have been evaluated by professionals. If I were autistic, someone would have told me." But that night, curiosity had gotten the better of me. I had started with a simple Google search. Autism in women symptoms. What I had found had shattered everything I thought I knew about myself. Article after article described experiences that were eerily familiar. The social exhaustion, the need for routine, the sensory sensitivities, the special interests that could capture my attention for hours, the difficulty with eye contact, the tendency to mask and mirror others in social situations. I had taken online screening tests, scoring high on every single one. I had watched YouTube videos of autistic women describing their experiences, and it had been like listening to my own inner monologue spoken aloud by strangers. But the breakthrough moment had come when I had found a video by Dr. Tanya Marshall about autism in girls and women. She had talked about how autism often presents differently in females, how girls are taught to mask and camouflage their differences from an early age, how many women go undiagnosed until adulthood because the diagnostic criteria had been based primarily on studies of autistic boys. She had described something called masking, the exhausting process of hiding autistic traits in order to fit in with neurotypical expectations. The way autistic girls learn to mimic social behaviors without truly understanding them, becoming skilled actresses performing the role of normal. As I had listened to her words, 28 years of confusion had suddenly clicked into place like puzzle pieces finally finding their proper positions. I had spent that entire night reading research papers, forum posts, and personal accounts. I had learned about stimmying, about special interests, about executive dysfunction, about sensory processing differences. Every single thing I had read had resonated with my lived experience in ways that no other explanation ever had. By dawn, I had been sobbing on my living room floor. Not because I had thought I was broken, but because I had finally found the missing piece of myself. Because I had finally had a word for the shape of my mind, a framework for understanding why the world had always felt so overwhelming and confusing. I was autistic. I had always been autistic. And somehow, deep in my bones, I had always known it. But if I was autistic, why had no one ever told me? Surely the therapists I had seen as a teenager would have recognized it. Surely the doctors I had consulted about my anxiety and sensory issues would have considered it. Unless someone had actively prevented them from seeing the full picture. That was when I had decided to look through my childhood medical records. I had called my mother and asked if she still had any of my old paperwork from when I was young. "Why would you need that ancient stuff?" she had asked, her voice immediately defensive. Just for my own records, I had said carefully. I want to have a complete medical history. There had been a long pause. I think we threw most of that away years ago. You know how we are about clutter. But my parents had never thrown anything away. Their basement was a museum of our family's entire history, with boxes of report cards and artwork dating back to kindergarten. So after my father's funeral, when I had been tasked with cleaning out the house, I had known exactly what to look for. And I had found it. All of it. The truth they had buried beneath decades of lies and misdirection. Now, sitting in that conference room with the evidence spread out before me, I had felt something I had never experienced before. Pure, crystalline rage. Not the confused, self-directed anger I had carried for years, wondering why I could not just be normal like everyone else. This was different. This was the fury of someone who had discovered they had been systematically gaslit by the people who were supposed to love and protect them. They had known. They had known I was autistic, and they had chosen to hide it from me. They had chosen to let me struggle and suffer rather than give me the understanding and support I had desperately needed. They had stolen my childhood from me, my teenage years, my 20s, nearly 3 decades of my life, lost to confusion and self-hatred because they had been too ashamed of my neurological differences to let me know who I really was. I had confronted my mother that very afternoon. I had driven to her house with the folder clutched in my trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard I had thought it might burst. She had been in her garden, tending to her prize-winning roses with the same meticulous attention she had always applied to maintaining appearances. She had looked up as I had approached, and for just a moment, I had seen something flicker across her face. Fear? Guilt? We need to talk, I had said, my voice steadier than I had felt. She had set down her pruning shears and followed me inside, moving with the careful dignity she had always worn like armor against the world's judgment. I had spread the contents of the folder across her pristine dining room table. The same table where I had done homework as a child, where I had eaten countless silent meals while trying to decode the unspoken rules of family interaction. Explain this, I had said simply. She had looked down at the papers, and I had watched the color drain from her face. For a long moment, she had said nothing, just stared at the evidence of her deception, as if it might disappear if she looked at it hard enough. Where did you find this? She had finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Does it matter? What matters is that you hid it. You hid my diagnosis from me for 28 years. You let me think I was broken when you knew exactly what was different about me. She had straightened then, lifting her chin in that familiar gesture of defensive pride. We did what we thought was best. We did not want you to be labeled. We wanted you to have a normal life. Normal. The word had exploded out of me like a gunshot. You call what I went through normal? The panic attacks? The sensory overload? The crushing loneliness of feeling other and not knowing why? There was nothing normal about that. You turned out fine, she had said, her voice growing stronger, more defiant. You went to college, you have a good job, you are successful. If we had told you, if we had let everyone know you were different, you would have been limited by that label your whole life. Limited. I had laughed, but there had been no humor in it. Do you have any idea what my life has been like? Do you know how many times I have sat in a bathroom stall crying, because I could not understand why social interactions felt like speaking a foreign language? Do you know how exhausted I have been, every single day, from trying to pretend to be someone I am not? She had looked away then, unable to meet my eyes. We just wanted to protect you. You wanted to protect yourselves. You were ashamed of having an autistic daughter, so you decided to pretend I was not autistic. You were willing to sacrifice my mental health and self-understanding to preserve your perfect family image. That is not fair, she had protested, but her voice had lacked conviction. What is not fair is lying to your child about who they are for their entire life. What is not fair is letting them think they are broken when you could have given them the tools to understand themselves. I had gathered up the papers then, my hands shaking with emotion. I spent 31 years hating myself because you were too cowardly to love me as I really am. We do love you, she had said desperately. We have always loved you. No, I had replied, my voice suddenly calm. You loved the version of me you were trying to create. You loved the mask I wore to make you comfortable. But you never loved the real me, because you never even let the real me exist. I had left her house that day knowing I might never return. And for months afterward, I had felt completely untethered, like an astronaut whose safety line had been cut, floating in the vast darkness of space. But slowly, gradually, I had begun to rebuild my identity from the ground up. This time, with the truth as my foundation. I had sought out a proper autism evaluation from Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in adult autism diagnosis, particularly in women who had been missed as children. The assessment had been comprehensive and affirming. Yes, I was absolutely autistic, and yes, it was completely understandable that I had been missed given the gender bias in autism research, and the fact that my parents had apparently withheld crucial information from previous professionals. Dr. Chen had helped me understand that my childhood behaviors, the need for routine, the sensory sensitivities, the intense focus on special interests, the social difficulties, were all classic presentations of autism in girls. But because autism research had historically focused on boys, and because girls were often better at masking their differences, countless women of my generation had slipped through the cracks. Your parents may have thought they were protecting you, Dr. Chen had said during one of our sessions. But what they actually did was deprive you of the self-understanding and support systems that could have made your life so much easier. With my official diagnosis in hand, I had begun the process of unmasking, slowly, carefully learning to let go of the exhausting performance of neurotypicality, and allowing my authentic autistic self to emerge. It had been terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For the first time in my life, I had given myself permission to stim when I felt excited or overwhelmed. I had started wearing sunglasses indoors when fluorescent lights bothered me. I had begun saying no to social events that felt overwhelming, without apologizing or making excuses. I had also started talking, first in online forums and support groups, then at local autism advocacy meetings. I had discovered that my story was not unique. There were thousands of women who had been denied their autism diagnosis as children, who had spent decades struggling with undiagnosed autism because of misogyny, ableism, and outdated diagnostic criteria. The more I had spoken about my experiences, the more I had realized that my voice could make a difference. Not just for myself, but for all the other women and girls who were still waiting for answers, still being told they were too sensitive or dramatic, instead of being recognized as beautifully, perfectly autistic. I had started giving talks at schools and workplaces about autism awareness, particularly about how autism presents in women and girls. I had written articles for autism advocacy websites. I had become increasingly involved in the neurodiversity movement, advocating for acceptance and understanding rather than the old model of trying to fix or cure autistic people. My talks had started small, a few dozen people at a local community center, then 100 at a university workshop. But my message had resonated with audiences, and word had spread. I had been invited to speak at larger conferences, on podcasts, at corporate diversity events. Each time I had told my story, about being denied my diagnosis, about the cost of masking, about the journey to self-acceptance, I had seen recognition in the faces of audience members, other late-diagnosed autistic adults, parents of autistic children, professionals who worked with autistic individuals. My voice had grown stronger with each telling, my message clearer and more urgent. I had become passionate about advocating for early and accurate diagnosis, for the rights of autistic individuals to know their own neurological identity, for the importance of neurodiversity acceptance in schools and workplaces. And then had come the invitation that would change everything. Dr. Marcus Rivera, the founder of the World Neurodiversity Forum, had reached out to me through my website. The forum was the largest international conference focused on neurodiversity advocacy, bringing together researchers, activists, and policymakers from around the world. We would be honored to have you as our keynote speaker, his email had read. Your story about late diagnosis and family dynamics would be incredibly valuable for our international audience. The conference will be held in Geneva this year, and we expect over 2,000 attendees. 2,000 people from around the world. It would be the largest audience I had ever addressed, and certainly the most influential. I had almost declined. Not because I was not ready. I knew my message inside and out by now, but because I had known with absolute certainty that my mother would try to come. She had been following my advocacy work from a distance, I knew. My cousin Zara had mentioned seeing her at some of my local talks, always sitting in the back, always leaving before I could spot her. She had never approached me afterward, never tried to reconcile or apologize. But she had been watching. A keynote at the World Neurodiversity Forum would be impossible for her to ignore. It would be streamed online, covered by international media, the kind of high-profile event that would make it clear to everyone in our small social circle that her daughter was not just speaking about autism. She was shouting about it from the rooftops. But that had also been exactly why I had needed to do it. So I had accepted the invitation. The months leading up to the conference had been a whirlwind of preparation. I had worked with Dr. Rivera's team to craft a presentation that would be both deeply personal and broadly applicable. We had talked about the importance of family support for autistic individuals, about the damage that can be caused by denial and shame, about the urgent need for better awareness and acceptance. I had practiced my speech countless times, refining each word and gesture. This was not just another talk. This was my chance to reach a global audience with a message that could literally save lives. How many other autistic children were being denied their diagnosis right now? How many adults were still struggling with undiagnosed autism because their families were too ashamed to seek answers? 3 weeks before the conference, my mother had called me. It was the first time we had spoken since that confrontation in her dining room over a year earlier. "I heard about your speech in Geneva," she had said without preamble. "I would like to attend." My heart had started pounding immediately. Why? Because you are my daughter. And despite what you might think, I do want to understand. I had wanted to say no. I had wanted to tell her that she had had 36 years to try to understand, and had chosen willful ignorance instead. But something in her voice, a vulnerability I had never heard before, had made me pause. "If you come," I had said finally, "you cannot disrupt the event. You cannot make it about you or your feelings. This is bigger than our family drama." "I understand," she had said quietly. I need to hear what you have to say." And so she had come. I had spotted her the moment I had walked onto the stage at the Geneva Convention Center. Front row, just as I had known she would be, wearing her best coat and her mother-of-pearl earrings, sitting with the perfect posture that had been drilled into me as a child. But for the first time in my life, she had looked small, uncertain. The confident mask she had always worn had slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. The auditorium had been packed. 2,000 faces looking up at me expectantly, representing dozens of countries and countless personal stories of neurodivergent experiences. I had felt the weight of their attention, the responsibility of speaking not just for myself, but for everyone who had been silenced or misunderstood. I had walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces. The spotlight had been warm on my face, familiar now after months of public speaking. But this time had felt different. This time, everything had been on the line. "My name is Margot Ellison." I had begun, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I am autistic. I have always been autistic. I just did not know. Because the people who were supposed to protect me decided I would be easier to love if I did not know who I really was." A collective intake of breath had rippled through the audience. In the front row, my mother had gone very still. "When I was 8 years old," I had continued, "a child psychologist diagnosed me with autism spectrum disorder. The diagnosis was thorough, comprehensive, and accurate. It could have been the beginning of a journey toward self-understanding and acceptance. Instead, it became a family secret that would define the next 28 years of my life." I had seen people in the audience leaning forward, hanging on every word. Some had been nodding in recognition. Other late-diagnosed adults who understood the particular pain of discovering that their struggles could have been avoided with earlier support and understanding. My parents hid my diagnosis because they were ashamed. They thought autism was something to be hidden, something that would limit my opportunities and define my worth. So they chose to let me grow up believing I was broken rather than different, defective rather than neurodivergent. My mother had been staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger or defensiveness, but something that looked almost like horror, as if she was finally understanding the full impact of what she had done. For 3 decades, I lived with crushing anxiety and confusion. I had sensory experiences that felt like torture, but had no framework for understanding why fluorescent lights made me feel like my skin was being peeled off, or why certain textures made me physically ill. I struggled with social interactions that felt like speaking a foreign language, but I thought everyone else was simply better at being human than I was. I had talked about masking, about the exhausting daily performance of pretending to be neurotypical, about the panic attacks and sensory overload episodes that my parents had dismissed as dramatics, about the special interests that had been discouraged because they were not normal enough. I developed an eating disorder in high school because controlling my food intake was one of the few ways I could manage my overwhelming sensory environment. But instead of recognizing this as a coping mechanism for undiagnosed autism, my parents sent me to therapy focused on body image and self-esteem. In the audience, I had seen people wiping away tears. These were not just my experiences. They were the experiences of countless neurodivergent individuals who had been misunderstood, misdiagnosed, or ignored entirely. The therapist did her best with the information she was given, but my parents carefully curated what they shared, painting my struggles as behavioral issues rather than neurological differences. They were so committed to maintaining the fiction that I was neurotypical that they were willing to sabotage my treatment rather than reveal the truth. I had paused then, letting the weight of that statement sink in. The auditorium had been completely silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning system. When I finally discovered my diagnosis at age 31, I felt 2 things simultaneously: relief that I finally understood myself, and rage that this understanding had been stolen from me for so long. My voice had grown stronger as I had moved into the advocacy portion of my speech. This was the part that mattered most, not just my personal story, but the broader implications for families and society. Early diagnosis matters, not because autism is something that needs to be cured or fixed, but because autistic individuals deserve to understand themselves. We deserve to have our sensory needs respected, our communication differences acknowledged, our ways of processing the world validated rather than pathologized. I had talked about the research showing that late-diagnosed autistic adults have higher rates of mental health issues, not because autism itself causes these problems, but because spending years without understanding or support creates trauma and burnout. When we deny autistic children their diagnosis, we are not protecting them from stigma. We are guaranteeing that they will internalize ableism and self-hatred. We are ensuring that they will spend years trying to fix something that was never broken in the first place. The audience had been completely engaged now, some taking notes, others nodding enthusiastically. I had felt the energy in the room shift as my personal story connected with broader themes of acceptance and advocacy. Neurodiversity is not a tragedy to be hidden or a disorder to be cured. It is a natural variation in human neurological development that brings unique perspectives and abilities to our communities. But we can only harness these strengths when we acknowledge and support neurodivergent individuals instead of forcing them to mask and conform. I had looked directly at my mother then, making eye contact for the first time during the speech. She had been crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she finally heard the full impact of her choices. To the parents in the audience, your neurodivergent children do not need you to fix them. They need you to love them exactly as they are. They need you to advocate for them, to learn about their neurological differences, to celebrate their unique perspectives instead of trying to make them blend in with everyone else. My voice had cracked slightly with emotion as I had delivered the most important part of my message. And to anyone who has been told they are too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult, you are not too much. You are exactly enough. Your way of experiencing the world is valid and valuable. You deserve to know who you are, to understand your own mind, to find your community and your voice. The standing ovation had started before I had even finished my last sentence. 2,000 people had risen to their feet, applauding not just for me but for everyone who had been silenced or misunderstood. The sound had been overwhelming in the best possible way, not the painful cacophony of unexpected noise, but the joyful thunder of recognition and solidarity. But I had only been looking at one person in that entire auditorium. My mother had remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, tears still streaming down her face. For the first time in my entire life, she had looked at me and seen who I really was. Not the version of me she had tried to create, but the authentic, unmasked, beautifully autistic person I had always been underneath the performance. And for the first time in my life, my mother had been completely speechless. After the applause had died down and I had left the stage, she had approached me backstage. I had been surrounded by other speakers and advocates, all wanting to congratulate me and share their own stories. But she had waited patiently at the edge of the crowd until I had been able to step away. "Margot," she had said, her voice hoarse from crying. Not here," I had said quietly. "Not now." She had nodded, understanding that this moment belonged to the community, not to our family drama. But 3 days later, she had called me. "I owe you an apology," she had said without preamble. "Not just for hiding your diagnosis, but for everything. For making you feel like you were broken. For prioritizing my own comfort over your well-being. For being so afraid of what other people would think that I forgot to think about what you needed." I had listened in silence, not ready to forgive but willing to hear what she had to say. "I watched your speech 3 times online," she had continued. "I read every article you have written. I bought books about autism in women. I am trying to understand what I put you through, and I am horrified by my own ignorance." There had been a long pause before she had spoken again, her voice barely audible. "I was wrong. About everything. And I am so sorry. It had not been enough. Not nearly enough to undo 3 decades of damage. But it had been a beginning." The speech had gone viral within hours of being posted online. The video had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, with comments from other late-diagnosed autistic adults sharing their own stories of family denial and eventual self-discovery. Major news outlets had picked up the story. I had been interviewed by CNN, BBC, and NPR about the hidden autism epidemic among women and girls. The Guardian had run a feature article about diagnostic bias in autism research. The New York Times had published an op-ed I had written about the importance of neurodiversity acceptance in families. But the moment that had truly changed everything had come 2 weeks after the conference, when I had received an email from TED Talks. "We would love to have you present your message on our main stage," the email had read. "Your story about family dynamics and autism diagnosis has resonated with millions of people around the world. We believe a TED Talk could amplify your message even further." The TED Talk had been recorded 6 months later in Vancouver. This time, my mother had not attended. We had agreed that she needed to work on understanding and healing before she could be part of my public advocacy work. But the impact had been even greater than Geneva. The TED Talk had been viewed over 10 million times in its first year online. It had been translated into dozens of languages. It had sparked conversations about autism and family dynamics in countries around the world. Publishers had started reaching out almost immediately. I had been offered book deals, speaking engagements, consulting opportunities. But the project that had excited me most had been the memoir. Unmasked, A Journey to Authentic Autism, had taken me 2 years to write. It had been emotionally brutal, revisiting every painful memory of confusion and self-doubt. But it had also been healing, allowing me to process my experiences through the lens of my adult understanding. The book had become a bestseller within weeks of its release. It had struck a chord with readers who had their own stories of late diagnosis, family denial, or struggles with neurodivergent identity. The reviews had been overwhelmingly positive, with many readers saying that my story had helped them understand their own experiences, or those of their family members. But the project I had been most proud of had been the nonprofit organization I had founded with some of the proceeds from the book. The Authentic Autism Foundation focused specifically on supporting late-diagnosed autistic adults and advocating for better diagnostic practices for women and girls. We provided resources for newly diagnosed adults, funding for diagnostic evaluations that were not covered by insurance, and training for healthcare professionals about autism in underrepresented populations. We also worked with families, providing education and support for parents who were struggling to understand and accept their autistic children. I had been determined that no other child would go through what I had experienced, denied their own identity because their parents were too ashamed to accept the truth. The foundation had grown rapidly, with chapters in 12 countries and a staff of over 30 people, many of whom were autistic themselves. We had helped thousands of people access diagnosis and support services. We had trained hundreds of healthcare providers about autism in women and girls. We had changed laws in 3 states to require insurance coverage for adult autism evaluations. But perhaps most importantly, we had changed the conversation about autism and family acceptance. My relationship with my mother had evolved slowly over the years following the Geneva speech. She had kept her word about trying to understand, attending support groups for parents of autistic adults and reading everything she could find about autism and neurodiversity. The first time she had visited my apartment after my diagnosis, she had brought earplugs and asked if I wanted her to bring different light bulbs to replace the fluorescent ones I had been struggling with. It had been a small gesture, but it had meant everything. The first time in my life that she had prioritized my sensory needs over appearances. We had started having regular phone conversations where she had asked genuine questions about my experiences. Not defensive questions designed to justify her past behavior, but curious, caring questions about how I perceived the world, and what I needed to feel comfortable and supported. "I keep thinking about all the times I punished you for stimmying," she had said during one of these calls. "I made you sit on your hands during dinner, so you would not fidget. I am horrified that I tried to suppress something that was helping you self-regulate." These conversations had been painful but necessary. She had needed to understand the full impact of her choices, and I had needed to hear her acknowledge the harm that had been done. It had taken 3 years, but we had eventually reached a place where we could have a relationship based on truth rather than performance. She had started coming to some of my local speaking events, not to monitor or control my message, but to genuinely support my advocacy work. The first time she had introduced herself to someone as the mother of an autistic advocate, I had nearly cried. It had been such a small thing, but it had represented a fundamental shift in how she saw both autism and me. She had also started volunteering with the Authentic Autism Foundation, helping with administrative tasks, and sharing her perspective as a parent who had learned to move from denial to acceptance. Her story had become part of our family education programs. A cautionary tale about the damage that shame and ableism could cause, but also a hopeful example of how families could heal and change. The work had been deeply meaningful for both of us. She had been able to make amends not just to me but to other families who were struggling with similar issues. And I had been able to see that people could change, that even deeply ingrained prejudices could be overcome with education, empathy, and commitment. 5 years after the Geneva speech, I had been invited back to keynote the World Neurodiversity Forum again. This time, the theme had been healing and hope, moving beyond trauma in the neurodivergent community. I had spoken about the journey from late diagnosis to self-acceptance, about the possibility of family healing, about the importance of forgiveness, not as something that excused past harm, but as something that freed survivors to move forward without carrying the weight of anger and resentment. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, I had told the audience. It does not mean pretending that harm was not done. It means choosing to define ourselves by our resilience and our growth rather than by the injustices we have survived. My mother had been in the audience again, but this time she had not been alone. She had brought my Aunt Patricia, who had been struggling to understand her own autistic grandson. They had sat together in the 3rd row, taking notes and listening with the kind of attention that showed they were truly trying to learn. After the speech, we had gone to dinner together, something that would have been impossible in the early years after my diagnosis. We had chosen a quiet restaurant with dim lighting and soft music, accommodations that she had suggested without being asked. "I am proud of you," she had said over dessert. "Not just for your success, but for your courage in telling the truth even when it was painful, even when it hurt me." "It needed to be told," I had replied. "Not to hurt you, but to help other people who are going through the same thing." "I know," she had said. "And I am grateful that my mistakes can serve a purpose, can help other families avoid the same harm." It had been the closest thing to closure that either of us would probably ever get. Not a fairy tale reconciliation, but something real and honest and built on genuine understanding rather than performance. The foundation had continued to grow and evolve. We had launched research initiatives studying the long-term impacts of late diagnosis. We had created educational materials for schools about autism in girls. We had developed training programs for therapists and doctors about recognizing autism in adults who had learned to mask their symptoms. One of our most successful programs had been the Family Healing Workshops, where late-diagnosed autistic adults and their family members could come together to process their experiences and learn new ways of relating to each other. I had facilitated many of these workshops myself, sharing my story and helping other families navigate the complex emotions that came with late diagnosis. I had seen parents break down in tears as they realized the harm their shame and denial had caused. I had seen autistic adults find their voices for the first time, learning to advocate for their needs and set boundaries with family members who had never learned to respect their differences. The work had been emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding. Every family that learned to move from denial to acceptance represented a victory against the ableism and ignorance that had shaped my own childhood. But perhaps the most meaningful moment had come 2 years ago, when I had received a letter from a 15-year-old girl named Jordan. "I saw your TED Talk in my psychology class," she had written. "My parents have been taking me to doctors for years because I have meltdowns and cannot handle certain textures and lights. The doctors keep saying I have anxiety, but after watching your talk, I think I might be autistic." I showed the video to my mom, and she cried and said she was sorry for not understanding. "We are going to see an autism specialist next month. Thank you for helping me find words for what I have been experiencing." Jordan had indeed been diagnosed with autism, and her parents had immediately connected with our foundation for resources and support. Unlike my parents, they had embraced the diagnosis as an explanation and a roadmap rather than a shameful secret to be hidden. Jordan was now thriving in high school with appropriate accommodations and support. She had joined her school's neurodiversity club and had started giving presentations to younger students about autism awareness. She had found her voice at 15, 36 years earlier than I had found mine. That was the real measure of success for everything I had built. Not the book sales or the speaking fees or the media attention, but the young people who would never have to spend decades hating themselves because they did not understand their own minds. The ripple effects had continued to spread in ways I had never anticipated. Other advocates had been inspired to share their own stories of family denial and eventual healing. Researchers had begun studying the phenomenon of hidden autism diagnoses and their long-term impacts. Policymakers had started considering legislation to prevent parents from withholding diagnostic information from their children. The conversation about autism and family dynamics had fundamentally shifted. Where once there had been silence and shame, there was now growing awareness of the importance of acceptance and early support. I had received thousands of messages over the years from people whose lives had been changed by hearing my story. Parents who had found the courage to seek evaluations for their children. Adults who had finally understood why they had always felt different. Families who had learned to move from conflict to connection. But the message that had meant the most to me had come from my mother herself, sent on the 5th anniversary of my Geneva speech. "My dearest Margot," it had read, "5 years ago, you stood on a stage and told the world about the harm I had caused you. You could have destroyed me with your words, but instead you chose to use your pain to help others. You turned our family's greatest failure into a force for healing and change. I will never stop being grateful for your courage and your forgiveness. I will never stop being proud to be the mother of such an extraordinary advocate. I love you exactly as you are, autistic, brilliant, and beautifully yourself." I had cried when I had read those words, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of finally being seen and loved for who I really was. The little girl who had asked her mother why she could not seem to get people had finally gotten the answer she had been searching for. Not because there was something wrong with her, but because she was autistic, and autism was just a different way of being human. And now, instead of hiding that difference, I celebrated it every single day. Standing in my office at the Foundation headquarters, looking out at the bustling city of Toronto where I had first discovered my true identity, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The pain of discovery, the rage of betrayal, the slow work of healing, and ultimately, the joy of authentic living. My desk was covered with letters from newly diagnosed autistic adults, thank you cards from families who had found healing through our programs, and research proposals for new initiatives to support the neurodivergent community. On the wall hung a framed photo from that day in Geneva, me at the podium, mid-speech, with 2,000 faces looking up at me in rapt attention. It reminded me daily of the power of speaking truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. Especially when that truth was uncomfortable. Because that was how change happened. Not through silence and accommodation, but through the courage to stand up and say, this is who I am. This is what I have experienced. And this is what needs to change. My story had started with a hidden diagnosis and a family shame. But it had become something much larger. A movement toward acceptance, understanding, and the radical idea that neurodivergent people deserve to know and love themselves exactly as they were. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my reflections. It was my assistant, letting me know that a reporter from the Washington Post was on the line for an interview about our latest research on diagnostic bias in autism evaluations. I smiled as I picked up the phone. There was still so much work to do, so many voices that needed to be heard, so many families that needed support and education. But I was no longer the confused, exhausted woman who had hidden her differences behind a mask of neurotypical performance. I was autistic, I was proud, and I was using my voice to make sure that no other child would have to grow up believing they were broken when they were actually perfect exactly as they were. My name was Margot Ellison. I was autistic. I had always been autistic. And finally, beautifully, the whole world knew it. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about overcoming adversity, finding your authentic self, and the courage to speak your truth. Your support helps us continue sharing these important messages of hope and healing. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are exactly enough, just as you are.